Welcome to Citizens Insight, the Citizens Party's interview series on matters of national and international importance. Today's interview is of extreme international importance. Our show today is based on a dossier that the Citizens Party has just released, which is explosive. It's called Plunging Towards World War III, the Made in London Temple Mount plot behind the Israel-Hamas War. And I think you can tell from that headline, this is deadly serious. And we are privileged to have a long-time Middle East expert, Michele Steinberg, to help us appreciate the significance of this dossier. Michele and her husband played key roles in writing the first version of this dossier, published back in the year 2000, as did some of the staffers from our Australian Alert Service. This current dossier that the Citizens Party has released updates that report that Michele helped to write. It is chock full of documentation, but it's 121 pages long, and we're not going to be able to do it justice today in this interview. There will be a link below. As you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link below that you can click on and download the full PDF and read it for yourself, hopefully stimulated by what we've discussed here today with Michele. Anyone who would like a hard copy of the report, you can call our office here in Australia toll free at 1-800-636-432 to get that and read through it at your leisure. But so that we can give you a flavour of what's in this explosive dossier and the context in which we've produced it, let us now turn to our special guest, Michele Steinberg. Welcome, Michele.
Hello, Robert.
So just to introduce you, Michele, and your impressive CV, you've spent 4 decades covering the United States Congress, the Middle East, and US national security debates as counterintelligence desk officer for Executive Intelligence Review magazine, and you're a contributor to international publications including Al-Watan, Middle East Briefing, People's Voice. You've been involved in book-length projects including Dope Inc., Britain's Opium War Against the United States, and Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Mafia, and Who's Sparking a Religious War in the Middle East, which is the 2000 report that I referred to. In 2020, you were the production editor of The Human Factor, The Phenomenon of Espionage by Colonel W. Patrick Lang, and you're currently Administrative Director for Consortium News, the United States-based independent news journal founded in 1995 by award-winning investigative reporter Robert Parry. So Michele, that is an impressive CV, so we're very privileged to have you with us today. I think you can agree, and I know the reason you've joined us is because the subject we're going to discuss is suddenly extremely urgent.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I am quite happy that this report has been reissued, because at this time it explains something that the world should know, but mostly does not. What is the role of the super elites in the British Empire? Everybody is more or less familiar with the U.S. role in providing arms and backing Israel with billions and billions of dollars and all kinds of international support. But the role of the British elites goes back hundreds of years and is very important. Now let's start with the immediate situation. This week, early this week, was the beginning of the sacred holiday, Islamic holiday, the Muslim holiday of Ramadan. And Jerusalem, and in particular, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the al-sharif, which is called by the Jewish people the Temple Mount, is the central area of worship. As we will say over and over again today, I think, it's the third holiest place of Islam. It is the place, the last place on earth where the Prophet Mohammed stood.
Yep.
And thousands, tens of thousands, and if it were completely open, probably hundreds of thousands of Muslims, not just from Palestine, but from all over the Islamic world, would be coming into Jerusalem for the worship during Ramadan. So Ramadan began on Monday. The first thing that happened in the lead up to this is that the National Security Minister of Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, I want everybody to remember that name today and tomorrow and the next day. He is the, again, National Security Minister of Israel in the Netanyahu government. And he's in charge of the police activities in Jerusalem. Well, just before this occurred, he made some really provocative statements leading up to Ramadan, which basically amounted to threats to close down the mosque to worshipers. Now, this has everything to do with the October 7th raid into Israel, which was called by the militants, by Hamas militants, the Al-Aqsa flood.
Yep.
And this is very important because in the 1980s, Itamar Ben-Gvir was actually caught with other Jewish nationalist thugs with explosives trying to get to the Al-Aqsa Mosque to explode bombs there. It was one of the early plots to blow up the mosque. Then later, in his incarnation as a militant, a state within a state, really. That's what his branch of the Temple Mount Faithful, they go by that name sometimes, the Jewish nationalists. His next major foray into national attention in Israel was when he jumped atop the limo that was carrying Yitzhak Rabin to a demonstration, to a speech.
The Prime Minister.
With other people, and this was on October 5th, 1995, exactly 1 month before Rabin was assassinated by another Jewish militant, Yigal Amir.
Yeah.
Now, this is the biography of a thug. He's been arrested many times. He's assaulted Palestinians brutally in gangs and so forth. He was hated by Jewish leaders like Rabin, who referred to him and his crowd as errant weeds that had to be eliminated from Judaism because they were destroying the Zionist dream. And that's something, it's a very complex situation that it is possible, and this will go through when we discuss the Oasis Peace Plan, it's entirely possible for Jews and Palestinians to live together in mutual cooperation. But this situation, this plot to destroy a sanctified religious site in the Muslim world and spark a religious war, this plot has to be uncovered. It has to be ended for this peace to come about. Now, the second thing in today's news, which I think is extremely important because it reflects not a sudden bout of conscience, but the intensity of the isolation of Israel and the isolation in the United States of the Joe Biden, they're calling him Genocide Joe now, right. The reaction of the world, including many Jewish protesters against the genocide that is going on in Gaza. So the highest ranking in history Jewish leader in the United States, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, has given a speech today saying Netanyahu's got to go. There has to be elections. He's gone too far allying with people in his cabinet like Ben-Gvir. But the truth is, he wouldn't have a government without him.
Yeah.
In the last 5.5 years, Israel had to have 5 elections because the society is so divided over economics, over war policy, over the occupation. So I fear one thing, that if there were elections, that these radicals, extremists, they could win.
Yep.
So that is not a solution at this point. Stop the war. Start the negotiations, get the hostages released, release the prisoners. And there's a new film being unveiled in Washington this week on the prisoner, the Palestinian prisoner leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, Marwan Barghouti, who is called the Palestinian Mandela.
Okay.
So a lot is going on. But the idea that this threat over the Al-Aqsa Mosque today, now, which could explode into general war, this puts the report just released by the Citizens Party right front and center.
And hopefully this discussion and the wider distribution of this report will help give people an insight into that urgency, because the plot we're talking about doesn't just blow up the Temple Mount or the Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the temple. It'll blow up the world into World War III. That is the very real danger. And people have to know this if they're going to realise, well, we better act decisively to pull back from the brink. And it's in the hands of the states around the world, like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, etc., who give all this full-throated support to Israel. But the history is very important, so let's go through that, and that's the benefit of inviting Michele onto this interview today, because Michele helped conduct a lot of the research for it. Before we begin our discussion, let me just give our viewers a broad overview of what we intend to cover in this discussion as we have the time. The South African government took Israel to the International Court of Justice, where it accused Israel of a clear intent to commit genocide in Gaza. The International Court of Justice ruled there is a plausible case of genocide for Israel to answer. What our dossier documents in detail is who created that genocidal intent and why. The Hamas incursion of October 7 was named Al-Aqsa Flood precisely because it referenced many attempts over decades, and particularly since the 1960s, by Israel's controllers in Britain and the United States to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque atop the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem. This is the third most holy site in Islam after Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, and is often called the Temple Mount by Israelis and people in the West. Blowing up Al-Aqsa would certainly unleash a bloodbath throughout the Middle East and likely even World War III. So in this show, we will sketch the history and current status of provocations around the Temple Mount, which all derive from the British Empire's divide and conquer policies beginning in the 19th century, which were continued and even drastically expanded when the British created Israel after World War II, unleashing violence that murdered and displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in what they call the Nakba. Within the context of this British and now Anglo-American imperialism, there are three main strands of those trying to blow up the Islamic shrines on Temple Mount and rebuild Solomon's Temple, which was destroyed in the early 6th century BC, by the way. Each of these strands has its own apocalyptic end times ideology of some imagined utopia, which they openly proclaim can only be achieved through war and horrific bloodshed. These three strands are: 1, British Freemasonry from the highest levels on down, coordinated by the United Grand Lodge of England, the mother lodge of world Freemasonry, which is always run by either a member of the British royal family itself or their designated representative. The key belief of Freemasonry is that it is descended from the original stonemasons who first built Solomon's Temple in the 10th century BC. The second strand is the brand of Christian religious fundamentalism, often known as British Israelism, and its derivative Christian Zionism, which was cooked up as an arm of British imperial policy in the 19th century and which has tens of millions of followers today in the US alone. And third, what today drives all of the genocide in Gaza, in the West Bank and in Rafah, the specific form of wildly messianic, bloodthirsty, right-wing Zionism preached by two notorious, actually insane rabbis, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who lived from 1865 to 1935, and his son Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook, 1891 to 1982. First with British backing and then with American support later, their teachings gave birth to the Arab-Israeli wars over the past decades, the entire Israeli West Bank settlement movement, the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1993 and related terrorist events, the current attempts to drive all Palestinians from Jerusalem and rebuild Solomon's Temple. That plot is already so advanced that the Israeli cabinet has held meetings underneath the Temple Mount, while Palestinians have been violently attacked while conducting their weekly Friday prayers in Al-Aqsa, which are largely forbidden or drastically limited. There are no conspiracy theories here. Everything we will outline is documented in detail in the dossier, including first-hand interviews which our investigators did with some of the plotters themselves. These include the top leaders in British Freemasonry, whose forebears have been swarming all over the Temple Mount since the 19th century. And as for the notorious neocons, who have almost entirely been running US foreign policy, including the United States' shameless military and diplomatic support for the present Israeli genocide, they are nothing but tools of British policy, as the British themselves have bragged. That's the background in brief. So let's start with some of the deep history of the British Empire, particularly in the Middle East, as a key subsector of the most powerful empire in the world throughout the 19th century and even up until the outset of World War II. That empire has never really disappeared, but just taken a more subtle form through Britain's worldwide financial empire emanating from the City of London, which is still the most powerful financial complex in the world, and through its far-flung intelligence services and subtle steering of its dumb American cousins, particularly the neocons. Michele, the research in this dossier traces the origins of this plot all the way back to the 19th century with the British Empire. Is what we are witnessing in Israel and Gaza today the legacy of British divide and conquer imperialism?
I would say absolutely yes. And if you look at a map of the world in the middle 19th century,
Yep.
First, let me read a quote which exists in the report from Lord Palmerston, writing from London in an 1840 letter to the ambassador to Constantinople. Now, I'm sure we can supply viewers with a map of the world and a map of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And you'll see way back in 1840, which is more than 100 years before the declaration of the State of Israel.
Yep.
You hear the Prime Minister of Britain writing to his ambassador saying, "There exists at the present time among the Jews dispersed over Europe a strong notion that the time is approaching when their nation is to return to Palestine. It would be of manifest importance to the Sultan, that is, of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, to encourage the Jews to return and to settle in Palestine. It would be a check upon any future evil designs of Mehmet Ali or his successor. I have to instruct your excellency to recommend to the Turkish government to hold out every just encouragement to the Jews of Europe to return to Palestine." Now, the Jews of Europe were completely dispersed at this time. And you can imagine that it was very, very difficult to communicate, no telephones, telegraphs, etc., generally available. And so the British elite were conducting a plan. Why did they want to have this beachhead right in the Middle East? Well, look at the map. The Mediterranean going through Istanbul into the Black Sea. I mean, this is absolutely, crucial navigation. the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, into the route to India.
Yes.
1840. Oh, well, let's look at the context of that. There was something in China going on, which we call the Opium War.
Yep.
Right. So the British Empire was consolidating an empire, and they needed a stronghold, a beachhead, if you will, to both screw up the Ottoman Empire and also create a base of operations for themselves.
Yep.
Now, how are they going to do this? How are they going to rip Jewish people who had not been in the Holy Land for thousands of years, rip them out of Europe and convince them to go to this area? Some kind of ideology had to be created. And here's where it gets interesting. And I have to refer viewers to actually read the report because it is so, so complex.
Yeah.
You had the future King Edward VII making trips to the Holy Land and visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Holy Mosque was already built.
Yep.
There was no Solomon's Temple. There was no Jewish temple. It had been destroyed in a war with the Romans, between the Jewish zealots and the Romans, in 70 AD. So there was only this Muslim holy place. But he had visited it in the name of this New Jerusalem. He became King of England. Others, in the next 20 to 30 years, created various branches of Freemasonry, which I would say culminated in the creation of a lodge called the Quattuor Coronati. I believe it was in the 1880s that Quattuor Coronati was created, and it's in the report. And out of that was spurned a number of institutions to study Palestine and also to study the most important iconography for the Jewish biblical scholars, which was Solomon's Temple.
Yep.
All right, there will be no Messiah until the temple is rebuilt.
And the overlap, Michelle, is with these British elites, is they are the leaders of Freemasonry, and Freemasonry itself draws all its rituals from the secrets of Solomon's Temple. And they take this interest in the Middle East and they start encouraging all this archaeological digging, etc. It starts way back then to create this, to generate this idea, which you're saying to me now is that with one, at least part of the intent was to give the scattered Jews of Europe something to focus on as a place to return to. The British created it. They fabricated this idea.
Right. I mean, Jerusalem had been an important acquisition for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam since the 12th century with the Crusades and so forth. Many kings spent great fortunes sending armies to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and a lot of blood was spilt. But ultimately, the Crusades ended, and there's a very strange little strain of thought, which the report identified called British Israel thinking, British Israel thinking. And in one of the most unique interviews ever conducted with a top-level Freemason, you will read the conversation between a European intellectual and the 7th Marquess of Northampton, Spencer Douglas David Compton. Now, 7th Marquess, that's a royal title. We don't have it here in America, and probably more Australians don't really don't know what in the world could that mean. But what I know about Spencer, as called Spenny, he is quite wealthy. One of his paintings, which was a Renaissance painting, I believe a Northern Renaissance, painting of the Gift of the Magi was actually auctioned at one of the big auction houses at the time to the price of $10.5 million, one of the highest prices ever gotten at such an auction. So, he's no pauper. He's no pauper there.
Yeah.
But he is not only an avid Freemason and a believer in being a British Israelite, but is also an admirer and claims to be a practitioner of the rituals of Alister Crowley.
Right.
Now, Alister Crowley is a turn of the century British figure, well known in America thanks to some of the counterculture, for his cult, which was called the Golden Dawn. And the Golden Dawn became very, very popular in the drug, sex counterculture of the 1960s because of his golden rule. The Jews and the Christians, Judeo-Christian tradition has the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt honor your mother and father, thou shalt not commit adultery. No. Alister Crowley had one commandment, which was, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Yep.
And in their rituals, they believed in the magical powers of fornication. So I'm not going to say more about the Marquess of Northampton, but that he's an admirer, an admitted admirer of Alister Crowley, should tell you something about his outlook. But this would almost sound impossible. But that is why we have to urge, especially leaders around the world, ambassadors, presidents, members of Congress, to read this, because the interviews are real. These are what these people, Northampton and his collaborators, talked about.
And you were going to read, Michele, you were going to read this quote from him on his British Israelism views.
Oh, I do have to do that because there's no way to summarize or paraphrase.
Not. I found this part absolutely fascinating.
So in addition to, these super elites are seekers of magic. They're seekers of magic. Power is not enough for them. They want supernatural powers. So in addition to Crowley, the magician, who is a Satanist, actually, self-avowed Satanist, and Northampton also wants to gain the special powers of the Kabbalah, the Jewish Kabbalah, which is what he talks about here. So he believes that England was colonized by one of the lost tribes of Israel. Remember, there were 12 tribes after Moses, but only 10 managed to go to the Holy Land. So Lord Northampton says, I think the tradition of the Kabbalah is very strong in England, because I think one of the lost tribes came to England. And I think you can spot them quite clearly in Old English families. I'm sure you can. I know they came to Ireland, then to the north of Wales, and then down into England. And then that became some of the oldest families we had. He also said that America had been colonized by another lost tribe. He says that was all predicted, that one would go to Hyperborea, the land of the north, and one would go across the sea. And so I think that America and England got the two lost tribes, and that is why they then, in a very intellectual Jewish way, started to run the world. End of quote.
And frankly, it's
British Israelites running the world. Secret powers.
My takeaway from this, Michele, is that it's a combination of the most ruthless British imperialism, hard-nosed British imperialism, flavoured by this idiosyncratic, mystical, bizarre belief system in themselves as these descendants of the lost tribes, etc., that consolidates their obsession with the Middle East, right? And this interview with Spenny, as you call him, this was in the 1990s. And so it shows you just how strong what you started off talking about from the 1840s and then the 1860s, etc. It's still as strong to this day in England among the elites. This bizarre idiosyncratic obsession, which is what drives their ruthless imperialism. Because the rest of the story of the founding of Israel really is that, isn't it? The British pushed through this project from the time of the Balfour, leading up to the Balfour Declaration, and from the time of the Balfour Declaration to the establishment of the State of Israel. The British pushed at every stage and made sure they made sure they got this nation established.
That is correct. That is absolutely correct. What was the Balfour Declaration? Well, it was a very, very brief letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, saying basically, I agree that the Jews should have a homeland in Palestine. It wasn't a big policy paper.
Yeah.
And who was Lord Rothschild? He was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. And again, this was a fulfillment. And by the way, Lord Balfour was also a bigwig in the Eugenics Society. I mean, He was a racist to the core, a racist killer to the core.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't out of a benign love for the Jewish people that this was being done. It was a geopolitical necessity. The world at the turn of the century was changing. I think the declaration was 1917, and communists had succeeded in a revolution in Russia at the time. The world was changing in a very, very big way, and so the founding of Israel was to begin. But you see, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount goes beyond this, because it's all about the kind of ideology that goes to the heart and soul of beliefs that are frightening. I mean, you and I were talking earlier about children growing up in the families of evangelical Christians, and the fear of damnation or not being part of the rapture, which is instilled in these young children. So the British intelligence has something which is very, very hard to follow and document. It was called the Occult Bureau. And I have to confess, after many years, I have read many articles about it, including articles in the 19th century, but there's been no WikiLeaks that has uncovered the Occult Bureau documents from the British Empire. But it was in the Occult Bureau that they studied the occult and magical superstitions of various cultures and figured out ways to manipulate them.
Yeah.
But I'm going to jump ahead, because Israeli intelligence mimicked that practice in the 1970s and 80s in the study of American Protestant denominations. Now, if anybody has seen the history of the racist Ku Klux Klan in America, the KKK had three enemies: Blacks, Catholics, and Jews.
Right.
And they were, the KKK was exclusively white people, and they were mostly Protestant. No Jews. For up until the 1960s in America, In many states, Jews were not allowed in country clubs,
Yeah.
in among the elites and so forth. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And this was instilled in the religions. These were Christ haters,
Yeah.
damnation, Christ haters.
Yeah.
And then the papists were even worse. But then in the 1970s, the Israeli intelligence, they set up a Ministry of Religious Affairs. And the Ministry of Religious Affairs conducted a years-long series of investigations over which Protestant denominations could be turned into American Christian Israelites, if you will. And by the late 1970s, you had one of the biggest televangelists in the United States, Jerry Falwell, going to Israel all the time, meeting with then Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And Begin actually gave Jerry Falwell an airplane, it is reported, to travel around the United States to spread the doctrine of the importance of working with the Jews. And the Protestant denominations created their own embassy in Jerusalem. It's called the International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem, ICEJ. And even to this day, they are sending volunteers to perform support functions for the IDF during the Gaza war. So this study was very, very important to get a base in the United States, which is extremely powerful today.
And that intersects what the report goes through, which is the origins of this end times obsession in Christian Protestantism that goes again back to the British and this character John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren, but who basically unleashed this religious doctrinal obsession with end times, and it raced around the Western world, this stuff, and this is what became, I would say, based on what you've just said there, this is what made those Protestant denominations susceptible to what the Israeli intelligence decided to do. And speaking personally here, having grown up in that, I just remember it was an overwhelming obsession, and everything was all about biblical prophecy, and the dates were all based around 1948 because we were being told in our churches that were very much influenced by these same American churches that 1948 was when the State of Israel was formed, and that was the start point for the end times, right? But why were we obsessed with the end times? Well, it's thanks to this character, John Nelson Darby, who the British sponsored to spread his ideas around the world, which you go through in detail in this report. Now, Michele, for the sake of time, I have to apologise to the viewer, and I might say this a few more times, but as I said at the beginning, we're not going to do justice to the depth of quality information that's in this report. You're going to have to read it.
Absolutely.
The beautiful thing is it's broken up into a lot of different articles, and you can read the different aspects of it. And then the second half of the report is all these interviews with characters like Spenny, who Michele quoted earlier, and you can see them say this stuff in their own words. But for our sake, and this is because Michele is an expert in this, I want to jump forward now to more modern times. Michele, there's a third strain of this plot. So the two strains that I talked about at the beginning, which is the British Empire and British Israelism and this Christian Zionism belief structure that we've just talked about. The third strain is the Jewish fundamentalism itself. And it appears that the Six-Day War in 1967 was a crucial turning point. From the beginning, many Israelis, including Benjamin Disraeli, the founding father of the State of Israel, understood that Israel and Palestinians would have to learn to live in peace. And early Israel is seen as being mostly secular as a society. But tell us about this phase change after 67 and the success of the Six-Day War, which fueled this third strain of this wildly messianic religious Jewish extremists and go through what you know about how they've gained in strength to this present day where they're now the government.
Okay, that could take, that could take a six-part series really
That's
to
true
explain
too.
it in detail. But again, in the report, it is so beautifully documented and laid out. And I'm just so I'm so sorry that the Americans who are waking up more and more, American former congressmen, ambassadors, other leaders around the world. I mean, it's amazing the opposition to the genocide going on in Gaza. I'm just so sorry that they didn't wake up to what was going on with this government when it took power.
Yeah.
In on 29 December 2022.
Yeah.
I mean, it's less than a year and a half that it's even existed, and it is responsible for provoking so much hatred and so forth. But the Jewish radicalism, it goes back also to the 19th century to something called religious Zionism.
Yeah.
Because some of the critics of Zionism said, well, wait a minute, there's not enough Bible in here, in this Zionism. We got to put the religion in it. And the religion is basically, well, we have to bring all of the Jews back to the Holy Land, the land of the Bible, Judea, Samaria. And it is only then that we can hope to have the Messiah come. Because isn't that the essence of Judaism, that after the fall of man, that there will be a Messiah to rescue the chosen people? So now the radicalism requires, number one, a return to the land of biblical Israel. Number two, the rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon. They have to have the temple. And then a sacrifice of a red heifer, which is also very, very much in the present tense. And the destruction of the enemies of the Jewish people. Now, these aren't really enemies. I mean, these are enemies that are determined by an agenda which is set by these leaders of these extremist factions.
Yeah.
And the Land of Israel Jewish nationalists or religious Zionists, they created a whole number of schools, yeshivas, and they were among the first settlers. Now, I'm going to go back and forth on the timeline a bit. Sure. Because it very detailed. But again, please, viewers, look at the report.
Yep.
Because the British began the plan for the Temple of Solomon way back in the 1890s when the visits were being made by the Freemasons and the Quator Coronati Lodge was being created. And they created several different organizations, such as the Palestine Exploration Fund, the Biblical Archaeology Society. Quator Coronati had its own journals that was studying the location of Solomon's temple. Because you're not going to have a Messiah without the temple. You're not going to be able to access the magic of Solomon's temple without the temple. That was the British elite's view, as told to us by Lord Northampton, and in their own writings.
And Michele, the dossier actually identifies this father-son combination of rabbis, the kooks, who actually developed that as a doctrine for the British and for the Zionists, because for centuries the belief had been, correct me if I'm wrong, but the belief had been the Messiah will return and the Messiah will rebuild the temple. And Rabbi Kook turned around and said, no, change the order. We have to rebuild the temple for the Messiah to return. And once you espouse that belief, that puts you on this collision course, inevitable collision course with the whole Muslim world. Because the only way you're going to rebuild the temple is destroy the third holiest site in Islam.
Well, yeah, and that was the handy thing, that all of these scientific studies, and they involved Christian fundamentalists, rabbis, and British scientists, no Muslims that I know of, determined that exactly where the temple must be built is exactly where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. So the mosque must be destroyed. And this is what every Palestinian knows.
Yep.
And many of the Muslims in the world now, including leaders like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and, the real rich countries and their leaders, they know that this is what the plot is. It's just somewhat bizarre, and talking about it puts them right up against the most elite institutions in the world. So they created, Rabbi Kook actually created one yeshiva, which is called the Merkaz Harav. I don't speak Hebrew, so I may be butchering the pronunciation. Merkaz Harav. Now, that's interesting, because the finance minister of Israel, who is one of the other fanatical settlers, by the name of Bezalel Smotrich, finance minister, that's where he studied.
Yep.
Right, that is where he was educated.
There you go.
So he has been one of these Jewish fundamentalist radicals since, before he was a teenager.
Yep.
And in 2005, he was arrested, not convicted, but he was arrested along with a few of his buddies with 700 liters of gasoline that they were going to use to explode the roads on the way to Gaza to prevent the closing down of the settlements, which occurred in 2005. Because like the West Bank, Gaza had been occupied, and it was a losing proposition. It cost too much to defend.
Yep.
And the gas had not been discovered, truthfully, offshore at the time. So it was left to the Palestinians. So now he's the finance minister, and he's another absolute warmonger who insists that every Hamas person has to be killed if it takes killing every Palestinian in Gaza to do it. So, as I mentioned before, please remember the name of Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Yep.
All right, because he was very, very important in the network that assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. And that was in November 1995. And that was the action which absolutely changed Israel.
Yeah.
Absolutely changed Israel. The situation behind that was the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Jews and the Arabs and the Muslims had met for months and months behind closed doors. The Americans were not involved in that. They were in Oslo, Norway, and they came up with a plan for a two-state solution. The United States stepped in a little bit later, and in 1993, there was a famous ceremony at the White House in Washington, D.C., when President Bill Clinton was in office, and he invited Yitzhak Rabin and PLO chairman Yasser Arafat. At that time, there was no Palestinian Authority. There was no self-rule at all of the Palestinians. It was just total occupation.
Right.
And they shook hands, and Prime Minister Rabin gave an amazing toast. He said, future belongs to those who have the courage to change the axioms. The axioms being that they were no longer enemies.
Yeah.
Now, what Rabin and the Labour Party and the Liberals and Israel were proposing was a program called Land for Peace. And it was a whole step process. Okay, we're going to start here. We're going to let you run a certain number of towns. And if the more peaceful we can become, the more cooperative and so forth, we will continue to expand that until we will look forward to a solution in which the occupation forces leave the Palestinian area. The radicals, the Jewish radicals, were totally infuriated about this. They hounded Rabin and his wife, demonstrations at his house, following his car, posters depicting him as a Nazi, attacks on his motorcade. And Itamar Ben-Gvir was at the center of those things. A couple of other nasty anecdotes. Ben-Gvir comes from a settlement which is on the other side of the Green Line. This is the area that was supposed to be Palestinian land, Palestinian state under Oslo, and they built more and more settlements. Right. And the settlement he came from is called Kiryat Arba. And it's one of the most radical, extremist, killer settlements. They have been involved in horrible, horrible attacks on the Palestinians. And they have suffered some horrible counterattacks from Palestinian militants as well. But they are a state within a state, an army within an army. They're not within the army, but they have their own army. And they're also famous because in 1994, a resident of Kiryat Arba by the name of Baruch Goldstein, who happened to be an American who had gone to Israel to, fulfill his biblical identity. He was a veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, and he took his automatic weapon and he went to the Cave of Abraham nearby Hebron and opened fire and killed, I don't remember the number, 24, 44, it could have been something like
40
that.
something, yeah.
40 something. And then in a return of fire, he himself was killed.
Yeah.
He was from Ben-Gvir's settlement.
Yeah.
So a very, very important analyst who you had a recent exchange with, Alister Crowley, former British official, he breaks it down like this. He said there's 3 factors which influenced Hamas's October 7th action.
Yeah.
And he puts it to the doctrine of the land of Israel, that there will be no 2 states. There will only be Israel from the river to the sea. That means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, it's all a Jewish state. The rest of you go somewhere. And the way they've described it is, hey, there's so many Arab states, they've got so much land, they don't have enough people. Take this vermin off our hands.
Yeah.
And they call them vermin, animals, cockroaches. The land to the sea doctrine. The second important one is the Temple Mount, that the temple must be rebuilt and Al-Aqsa must be destroyed. And he wrote an interesting article in a Beirut newspaper, which said, surprise, was anybody surprised about this? Why would they be surprised? Hamas has been warning against the attacks on Al-Aqsa for quite a while now, quite openly, especially since this government came into power, and they called the attack on October 7th Al-Aqsa flood.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at the timing on that. He is absolutely on target with this. The government involving the people I've been stressing, aside from Netanyahu, which is Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they were sworn in 29th of December in 2022. By January 3rd, the Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, was marching with his minions and police on Temple Mount and declaring, we own this. We're here to show that we are in control. In May, he was back again with an even bigger force. In July, they weren't on Temple Mount, but they were part of an attack on the refugee camp in the West Bank of Jenin, in which was a brutal, brutal attack.
Yep.
Killing children, etc.
And Michele, while the rest of the world probably wasn't paying attention to all this, Hamas certainly was.
Certainly, absolutely. I mean, that's their job. They're government, and one of the big criticisms, one of the reasons why they won the election is that the Palestinian voters said, "Hey, this guy, this Mahmoud Abbas, I mean, he hasn't been elected since it's 20 years, and he's asleep at the switch. They're not paying attention." So a new leadership was elected in 2006, but never was allowed to rule. So I think I've hit on about as much as I think people can digest in one interview, and I just really know that people will find this report fascinating, instructive, and it could actually lead to a clean out of the networks from the very dregs of Jewish terrorism that carry out things like one incident in Jerusalem where four of the settler thugs they bullied a Palestinian kid who happened to be isolated, tied him up, caused him to drink gasoline, and then lit it. This was not, 20 years ago. This was in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
It's a very, very, very brutal situation.
Well, let's conclude. I just want to touch on two things just to bring this home for people, because we've given the raw material there, and we're going to put some, like I said, links below. There'll be a link to the report. You've got to read the report. We'll also put a link to a very interesting video that's just been posted. Michele gave reference before. We don't have time to go through it, but part of the prophesaical side of this that is driving these Jewish fundamentalists is being acted out now in real time, and Hamas referred to it when they justified the October 7 action, and that's this red heifer prophecy and the planned sacrifice of a red heifer. We'll put a link to that below so people get a sense that, hang on, the clock is ticking on this. But we don't want to leave it just in totally bad terms. But before we get on to there's one positive thing I think we should end on, Michele. But before we do that, I just wanted to make reference to the fact that in 1988, the US Department of Defense funded a study by Associate Professor Ian Lustig. And the existence of this study shows that the American professional foreign policy class, establishment, have known this danger for decades. They have known this. They did a study on it that forecast, look, if these religious extremists take power in Israel, there will be at best a 30 years war, like the 30 Years' War that destroyed Europe in the 1600s, or World War III. I mean, that's what this report said in 1988. And so when you see that, you have to think, well, why on earth? What have the British and Americans been doing in helping to cultivate these people to get to the point where they are now in charge, knowing the danger that they present?
Well, part of the issue is that factions of the American establishment and the Anglo-American establishment,
Yep.
That's exactly what they want and what they require in their own minds for the control they want to exert over nations and the superiority that they have, the hegemony.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I can say that without American money and British ideas and some money, it seems that the British are less generous with the funding of these things than the stupid Americans. But without that help, these operations would not exist.
Yeah.
Now, the rabbi who is the godfather of the latter-day godfather, not Rabbi Kook, who goes back to the turn of the century, the 20th century, in the late 19th century. But the latter day, Meir Kahane, was an American. He was a spook in the sense that he worked for various American intelligence agencies and specifically worked for Air Force intelligence. And he created in the United States the group called the Jewish Defense League. Their motto was, "For every Jew, a 22." And they committed a whole number of assassinations. They'd hunt down people who were supposedly Nazis during the Nazi regime, who worked in concentration camps. They rigged car bombs to their cars. They put bombs under the limousines or autos of Soviet diplomats. And they killed a Palestinian Christian who was the leader of a Palestinian group in California by the name of Alex Oda. In fact, one of Ben-Gvir's collaborators was the American man, Andy Green, who lives in Israel to this day, because he was able to be the main suspect in the bombing of Alex Oda's office. When Alex opened the door to go to work in California, a bomb went off and he was killed that day. But Andy Green was one of the people that was about to be indicted, and he fled to Israel where there's no extradition treaty, and he lives there today, and he's a collaborator with Ben-Gvir in some of the Temple Mount antics. So the study by Lustig, and I can't say whether he's written some other things which indicate that he's very critical of Jewish fundamentalism. But what he was describing was something that U.S. intelligence paid him to study.
Yep.
Why? Because they wanted to bring it about.
That is.
They wanted
shocking.
to bring it about, and it's no secret that U.S. intelligence and sometimes the Defense Department, State Department, has been dominated by the neoconservatives. Yeah. Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Michael Ledeen, whose wife Barbara had been one of the top research and writers for the Biblical Archaeology Review. It's no secret that these people have enormous clout in the military-industrial complex in the United States. And
from an imperial standpoint, Michele, these people don't want peace.
They don't. No.
Peace does not fit with an imperial agenda. They need to have the conflict to justify the military spending and all those sort of things that give them their power.
Absolutely. And they use it to to great advantage in the short term.
Yes.
In the short term. But if you look at their wars, I mean, all that invasion of Afghanistan, which went on for over 20 years, and then turning over the state to whoever and recognizing Taliban, the unnecessary invasion of Iraq, which brought about, they created ISIS. I believe you also have covered that.
Yes.
In extensive detail about what went on inside the prisons in Iraq and actually bringing about this Islamic fundamentalism, which is another scary thing. And it was right under the noses and with the help of American practitioners.
Well, we absolutely do want peace. The people of Gaza sure as hell want peace. They're being absolutely slaughtered at the moment. I just wanted you to comment as the final topic for this interview. The dossier ends with a few articles about the Oasis plan, what you call the Oasis plan. And when you talk about Yitzhak Rabin and that episode in the mid-90s, what it does tell you is that there was a real chance for peace that was sabotaged by these very networks that we've been talking about. And it shows you that people want peace, though. And what could the world have looked like if it hadn't been sabotaged? But what do we need to? What would you like to say about the Oasis plan and what it could achieve for the region now if we had the right commitment to it within Israel and without?
Well, Israel has a tremendous amount of technology, smart people. And they also have a nuclear capability. They stole nuclear technology from different circles in the United States and France in the 1960s. That's another story, and another dark side of the thing. But the combination of that technology and Palestinian manpower, because one of the big problems for Israel has always been the demographics that the Palestinian population is actually much larger, and it wasn't until another side of the cult is the Jewish fundamentalists have to make babies, so they've got families with 14, 16, 20 children. To try and change the balance and so forth. But the idea of putting the population and the technology together for man-made rivers. I mean, just one of the things that I like the best is called the Med-Dead Canal. It goes from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, and you dig a canal, take the water from the Mediterranean Sea, and use nuclear power to desalinate the water and make the desert bloom.
Yep.
And that there would be, it would just be an economic powerhouse. The type of thing that you see going on in China. And this is really our hope and our dream, that we can still have enough sanity among the Jews of Israel and the Palestinians of Palestine to get together and bring about these kinds of dreams with sovereignty for Palestine at the same time. Because there have been some offers on paper. Netanyahu did this stunt a couple of years ago. We got the plan. If they'll cooperate, we're going to build beautiful cities for Gaza. All you have to do is forget about the state, throw out Hamas, and give up all your rights, and you'll have beautiful cities. And they were too. Come on, that's you're trying to buy us off, and it's not going to work.
Yeah.
But my husband Jeff Steinberg, who was one of the things that he has done recently is lectured at various colleges. And in the course of that, he met a retired American general who is still doing visits to Israel and working with Israelis and Palestinians about joint technological, agricultural projects, and so forth. So the dream is very much there. The Oasis plan, which is very, very detailed, was drafted by the economist Lyndon LaRouche, who we all know and have studied, in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And he was in very close communication with some of the Israeli government leaders about this. And unfortunately, because of superpower intervention, the kibosh was put on this plan. But the plan still exists, and I think that this is going to be part of the solution for peace.
And look, we'll put a link below to a video specifically about the Oasis plan as well that people can look at. So Michele Steinberg, thank you very, very much for your time tonight. It's morning here in Melbourne. It's evening there in the United States East Coast. And thanks for sharing with us your knowledge of this very complex subject, as you said at the beginning. But you did the world an enormous favour with your role in helping to produce this report 20 years ago. It's never been more urgent and topical than now. And if people can just understand these forces and these intentions behind what we're seeing, then hopefully we can, like I said, generate the urgency needed for leaders in around the world to step in and pull the worst of these people back from the brink. So Michele, thanks for joining us today on Citizens Insight.
Well, thank you, Robbie, and thank you to the Citizens Party for the invitation. And please, viewers, take the time, read this report.
Read the report. We can't emphasize it enough. Read the report. Thanks, Michele.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.